Men in our society are facing a crisis. Men are far more likely to develop an addiction, commit suicide, or go to prison. 93.1% of inmates in prison are men, and men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. A major reason for this is that from an early age, men are conditioned to behave in a narrow definition of masculinity. When I was a kid, I thought that being a man meant being tough, strong, and self-sufficient. In reality, I was terrified to talk about my problems and emotions. This led to me getting arrested for fighting at 13 and to years of struggling against drug and alcohol abuse. I learned the lesson of vulnerability one night when I was 18. I'd taken a lot of drugs with a friend, and I ended up alone in my car in the middle of winter without any heat, losing touch with reality. I knew in that moment that I needed to surrender and ask for help. That decision saved my life. A few years ago, I was leading a group on masculinity and addiction at the men's residential treatment center I was working at. After I'd finished my introduction about how masculinity can lead to addiction, one of the guys started to criticize the idea. He started saying things like, "The world's not going to cut you any slack because you're vulnerable, and sometimes you just have to be a man." He went on to explain that these were values that he was instilling in his son because he didn't want him to get beat up and he wanted him to be successful. I thanked him for sharing, and I continued to facilitate the group. A lot of the other guys started sharing about how their ideas about masculinity had damaged relationships and in a lot of ways led to their addiction. About halfway through the group, the guy that had given me a hard time started crying. When there was a pause in the conversation, he spoke up and said, "Oh my God, I just realized I'm teaching my son to be like me. I don't want my son to be in rehab at 40. He went on to explain how his father's lack of empathy and his experience in the military had made him terrified of sharing his problems and emotions, and that even today he was ashamed to talk about his addiction to cocaine and alcohol. He looked at me fervently and said, "This needs to stop. I can't let my son end up like me." Some common ideas about what it means to be a man are to be strong, don't ask for help, don't cry, don't show too much affection, and take on all the responsibility of keeping one's family safe. The result is men who are afraid to show their emotions, who suffer silently, and who avoid intimacy. This can result in some very negative coping strategies like drug and alcohol abuse, violence, or even suicide. A lot of men struggle with vulnerability. This is a problem because vulnerability is essential for living a life full of love and intimacy. Vulnerability means sharing the parts of ourselves that we are afraid might be hurt or criticized. We often avoid sharing our ideas, struggles, and emotions because we're afraid of being judged. What is the impact of this? We avoid asking for help, and we hide the parts of ourselves that have the most to offer. In order to have healthy men in our society, we need to teach them how to be vulnerable and to find healthy ways of expressing their emotions.